All right, awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Richie. So there's these two literatures in psychology that support the idea that compassion is limited. One of them is compassion fatigue, and the other is compassion fade. Sometimes this is called psychic numbing or the collapse of compassion. And there's also a relationship with identifiable victim effect. And my second monitor stopped working, so we'll see how this goes. Anyway, so the common denominator in this research is that when people are exposed to too much suffering, their ability to feel compassion is weakened. So compassion fatigue, the definition more specifically is that people oftentimes feel a weakened compassion response after repeated exposure to suffering and trauma. And this has primarily been studied in the context of people who have emotionally demanding jobs, caregivers of people who are ill, and also in the context of people who are kind of repeated exposure to media that covers global problems. And negative effects associated with compassion fatigue include the poor mental and physical health outcomes of those experiencing compassion fatigue, as well as worse relationships with others. For instance, the people who they are providing care for, such as in the medical profession, and also relationships at home. Compassion fade is a little bit different. So it's this idea that there's a negative relationship between the amount of compassion that people feel and the number of people in need. So this has most often been studied in the case of mass atrocity, where there's a large number of people suffering, or people oftentimes feel less compassion when there are more people suffering. And the negative effects of this is that people and groups oftentimes don't have the proper motivation to address large-scale problems. So these ideas and findings of compassion fade and compassion fatigue have been widely reported in news media outlets. And this research might help promote the belief among the public that compassion is somewhat limited. So there's examples of this in popular outlets such as The Atlantic and Vox and the New York Times, which have all covered this research and these ideas that compassion is limited. But I want to pose the question of what if we're wrong about the limits of compassion, and what if our science is actually helping fuel a self-fulfilling prophecy that undermines our capacity to be compassionate? So there are some hints that compassion may not actually be as limited as we think. So for instance, compassion for all people is a tenet of some of the world's major religions. And resource models of other mental phenomena have been called into question, maybe most notably with willpower and ego depletion. And relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, there's research showing that people's beliefs, or other times called mindsets, about whether willpower is limited and fatiguing actually predict belief-consistent experiences of willpower. So in other words, people who believe that willpower is limited are more likely to experience it as such. So likewise, what I'm going to talk about today is research that explores the idea that maybe people's beliefs or mindsets about compassion as a limited resource may affect people's feelings of compassion and compassion fatigue. So that's the idea that I'll be exploring in the research I talk about today. So just one quotation that I think kind of hammers home this idea that not everybody believes in compassion's limits is from a popular or a pop psychologist, Brene Brown, who said, when you practice empathy and compassion with someone, there's not less of these qualities to go around, there's more. Love is the last thing we need to ration in the world. The refugee in Syria doesn't benefit more if you conserve your kindness only for her and withhold it from your neighbor who's going through a divorce. So ideas was a correlational study with prolific participants, and we asked them 4 questions about their beliefs about compassion as a limited resource. So for instance, this was one of the items on our 4-item scale: feeling compassion for others, exhaust your resources, which you need to refuel afterwards. After this, we provided them a description of a task that we designed that might elicit compassion fatigue. And we asked them what the degree to which they anticipated that feeling compassion for all the people in the task would be fatiguing. After that, we gave them the task, and this task showed they saw not 9 photos of people suffering one by one. And In each photo, they asked the degree to which they felt compassion for in response to the image. And then afterwards, they reported their experienced compassion fatigue. That's the same scale as the anticipated compassion fatigue, just reporting what they actually experienced during the task. So the first thing that we wanted to explore is, do people actually vary in their beliefs about compassion as a limited or unlimited resource? And we did see variability in people's responses, as you can see on this histogram. And people believing that compassion was limited, in other words, those who had a limited compassion mindset, expected more compassion fatigue, felt lower average compassion in response to people in the pictures, and they reported feeling more compassion fatigue after the task. And we also looked at people's compassion responses over time, picture by picture. And those who had a limited compassion mindset, as indicated by the blue line on this graph, felt less compassion as the task went on, picture by picture, whereas those with a more unlimited mindset, or those at the mean of our scale, did not show those same decreases over time. So in the second study, we wanted to see, are these beliefs malleable? And is there a causal relationship between these mindsets and compassion fatigue? So we again recruited participants from Prolific. And for this, they listened to an 8-minute podcast that we created. And we called it Fast Feels, a short podcast about emotion. And they were randomly assigned to a limited versus unlimited condition, where the podcast talked about the idea of compassion as limited versus unlimited. And it featured interviews with a caregiver and someone who was talking about their experiences reading the news with regards to COVID. And after this, they completed the same picture viewing task from study 1. And for those in the limited condition, we were able to successfully change their beliefs. So in other words, people's beliefs are malleable. They believe that compassion was more limited in the limited condition. People in the limited condition felt lower average compassion picture by picture, and they also felt more compassion fatigue at the end of the task. When we look at people's compassion responses over time, people in the limited condition did not show greater decreases over time as compared to those in the unlimited condition. That's the right-hand graph on this screen. But on the left-hand graph, you can see if we replicate the analysis from study 1, those who believe that compassion was limited using measured mindsets, though they did show greater decreases in compassion over time compared to those who believe that compassion was unlimited. So in the next study, we wanted to see, do these beliefs actually affect well-doing? It's shown that they have consequences for people's feelings of compassion, but we didn't have any behavioral variables yet in these studies. So for the study, we had them listen to the same 8-minute podcast, and following a filler task, we gave them the opportunity to give social support. So specifically, they had the opportunity to give emotional, informational, and instrumental social support for students who had lost their jobs due to COVID. These students didn't actually lose their jobs due to COVID. This is what we told participants. And what we did is we told participants that we had a number of students in our classes that had lost these jobs or internships as a result of COVID, and that they were trying to refine materials that they were sharing on LinkedIn as a way of increasing their odds of getting another job or internship. And we were giving participants the opportunity to give feedback on these LinkedIn materials. So this might be an example of some of the materials from one of the students. And then participants could give their emotional social support in a free response question, informational social support, or in other words, advice for how to improve their materials in a second free response question, and then instrumental social support, which was more of a hypothetical, which was the extent to their likelihood of connecting the student with someone in their network. And what we saw is that for participants in limited condition, they gave lower quality emotional social support as rated by coders of these free response questions. And likewise, coders coded that people in the limited condition gave lower quality informational social support as well. And they were also less likely, for those in limited condition, to say that they would recommend this person to someone in their network. So the final study I'm going to talk about is whether limited compassion mindsets constrain our moral circles. So I've always been interested in the idea of moral expansiveness stemming from Peter Singer and also studied by Daniel Crimson, Brock Bastian, which they call moral expansiveness. And this captures the idea that people have different moral circles where they have people in their inner moral circle, people for whom they feel strong moral obligations, and then entities that are kind of increasingly more distant from them, where they feel less and less moral obligation or concern as people become more distant. So frequently, for instance, people feel most moral obligation for close friends and family, and the least or no moral concern for maybe the environment or wrongdoers or non-human animals. So for this study, we had participants listen to the same podcast that I told you about earlier, and then we asked them about the degree to which they thought compassion involved trade-offs. So with the idea being that maybe for people who believe compassion is limited, that because it's limited, feeling compassion for one entity might involve a necessary trade-off where they won't have as much compassion or kind of emotional resources for another entity, consistent kind of with this idea that Brene Brown was putting forth in her quote that I showed you guys earlier. So an example item from this 4 items or from this 6 item scale was feeling deep compassion for distant entities can come at the cost of feeling compassion for those close to me. And then we had them complete the moral expansiveness scale, where participants rate their degree of moral concern for 30 different entities, again, ranging from close friends and family to in-groups, out-groups, well-doers, wrongdoers, non-human animals, etc., on a 4 item scale. And people in the limited condition felt greater trade-off, compassion trade-off concerns and lower overall moral expansiveness. And as we predicted, people, these lower moral expansiveness was mediated by these increased compassion trade-off concerns. So in other words, when you believe that compassion is limited, people are more likely to think that there's these trade-offs, and that helps explain why people are potentially less morally expansive when they hold these limited compassion mindsets. So just to summarize the findings that I talked to you guys about, the belief that compassion is limited varies across people. It can be manipulated through a science-based narrative and predicts more compassion fatigue, less well-doing, and lower moral expansiveness. So the theoretical implications of this work is that first, we identify a potential antecedent to compassion fatigue. And also this research to an extent calls into question the limits of compassion. It's not to say that there aren't potential limits. It's more so just that we don't necessarily know what those limits are, and they might not be as hard and fast as we maybe previously thought, and that people's beliefs about compassion may play a role in the limits of compassion and the very resource models that we use to think about compassion and other potentially emotional and mental resources. It identifies a potential route for intervention, and the fact that scientific findings broadly may have the power to influence beliefs in a subsequent self-fulfilling cycle. So as far as future directions for this work, we're hoping to do some more qualitative work to gain a richer understanding of people's beliefs. So to this point, we asked about the limited nature of compassion and also whether it's fatiguing. It's possible, although those dimensions might be correlated, they might be somewhat separate. And by doing more qualitative work and scale development, we might be able to build a better scale and separate out more multiple dimensions of these beliefs. We also have some work indicating that there's cultural differences in beliefs about compassion. So some preliminary work shows that people in China, for instance, have more limited beliefs about the nature of compassion. We also want to extend this work to look at different kinds of outcomes, and more specifically, outcomes around compassion fade and psychic numbing, which is something I talked about in the beginning of this talk. So does believing that compassion is more limited lead people to feel less compassion when there's a large number versus small number of victims? And finally, we want to potentially do this work with people who are at risk for compassion fatigue, such as healthcare workers, and develop an intervention to see whether this could make them less likely to feel compassion fatigue in the settings in which they might be expected to do so. So with that, with all that, I'd like to say thank you to the Life Improvement Science organizers. This has been a really fantastic conference so far. And to also the people attending this talk, thanks for coming. My collaborator, Julia Lee Cunningham, she's fantastic. The funding sources for this research, and also my research assistants. Alrighty, so it looks like we have maybe 2 minutes for questions before I have to go. Sounds like it worked. I couldn't see the chat because of my second monitor. Everything got a little messed up there, but it looks there's claps, so it seems like people heard what I said.
Yes, so thank you very much for the great talk. So if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand via the Zoom functionality, and then we will unmute you.
All right, so the Google Doc. I will try and answer one question while I can. Let's see here.
Is there? Sorry, I don't see them for me.
I'm having, let's see here. Oh, let's exit full screen. I can't click the link in the, let's see here. Oh, here we go. Trying to put myself in the participant's shoes. I wonder if I feel guilt when looking at the pictures. Yeah, is that, I think like probably the pictures, and not all the pictures look the same. There are different kinds of pictures, but surely they elicited, I would guess, more than one kind of emotion. So that's fair. I'd have to think about like how that might interact with the nature of feeling compassion and what the implications would that would be.